Thank you for coming to this interview. This is the third in a series that the American Membrane Technology Association is videoing for our archives and for the interest of our members. When we roll out our new website, which will be in a few weeks, we plan to post clips from these interviews on there so that the membership can access them and take a look at what the true pioneers of the industry look like and what they have to say about it. So thank you all for coming. My name is Ian Watson. I'm the Executive Director of the American Membrane Technology Association. AMTA, as it's known, is the leading technical association in the United States for the promotion of membrane technology for the treatment of drinking water and other membrane applications involved with water. I'm going to introduce our guests from my left. We have Bill Hendershaw. Next to him we have Stuart McClellan, Paul Culler, Bruce Goodin, and Ben Mohlenhoff. And I'd like each of you, starting with Paul, if you would just say a few words about your background and your arrival at Basic Technologies.
Well, I entered the membrane industry in 1969 with Havens International in California. And after a year of driving a pilot plant up and down the eastern half of the United States, I decided that maybe there was an opportunity with this technology. It was a lot of strange stories to tell about those days, but and then in 1970 I ended up at Permuted in Paramus, New Jersey as the product manager. We were introducing the DuPont B9 membrane to industry, and we had an exclusive agreement that was to last 3 years, but we had accomplished in 1.5 years what DuPont wanted to get done. So things kind of leveled off, and Permuted, we made a lot of the first installations in the electronics industry where the membrane was really used as a super filter to filter out bacteria rather than the removal of salt. And then in 1974, I was encouraged by some people to take off for Florida and start a company down there, and which I did with the help of some venture funding people, if you please. We were going to have 10 shares, 10 different individuals, and it ended up that when we got 6, the 6 that were already there, the company had been formed. And they said, well, this looks good, we don't need any more, we'll take care of you, however that might be. So that's the way BTI, Basic Technologies, got formed. And we made, really, a lot of the first installations in Florida, kind of springing off on experience that I'd had traveling with Fred Trippensey in Florida and in the early 70s. So that was the beginning of Basic Technologies, and it took about a year prior to 74 to make it come together, and I went down July 31st, 1974, and then a couple, 2 or 3 months later, why Stu joined me down there, and we ended up with 3 or 4 employees to begin with. So that's kind of how it got started. Bill came as Vice President of Marketing in January of 78.
Actually, February I joined. I left Mute at the end of January.
Ben joined us. I remember
right about the same time.
I came back from a trip overseas, and Ben, there was a guy named Rob Lockyer who hired Ben, and I said, you hired Ben Mohlenhoff? Because he wasn't in the room or there at the time being. Rob said, yeah. I says, well, we go to church together. And, so anyhow, that's kind of, and then Bruce came, when did you come, Bruce?
1980.
1980? And we had our ups and downs. Let everybody else tell the stories of some of the exciting times we had in trying to make our own pressure vessels and using PVC pipe, not realizing at the time that PVC pipe is externally controlled, not internally controlled, and that didn't work very well for the brine seals, etc.
Yeah. Now, Stuart, you came down almost at the beginning. You started your career with Permuted, right?
I started in '64, the summer of '64, at Permuted in the water treatment, wastewater treatment industry. And then I finished my college in '69 and was in the project process engineering group, working mostly on ion exchange and deaerating heaters and hot process softeners. And John Fiore was assigned to work with Paul when he came to work on this new technology of reverse osmosis, and at some point he asked me to swap places with him, and so I joined Paul as a dedicated project engineer to do the engineering work for the systems we bid at Permuted, as well as, if we got the job, to process them through the house and do the startup engineering as well. I joined Paul in fall, October, November of '74 as his Vice President of Engineering and Manufacturing. And as he said, there were very few of us at the time, and so we wore a lot of different hats and doing the different things. And one of the first things I was charged with by Paul when we got there was to develop the method of using structural member fiberglass for the skid materials, as opposed to unistrut, steel unistrut, which was the common structural member used to build these small RO skids at the time. And that was a real interesting challenge to try and develop how to connect these pieces together and come up with a structure that would support the weight necessary to allow us to ship and install prepackaged, pre-engineered RO systems.
BTI had been in existence maybe 2 or 3 years before you joined, Bill?
I actually joined Permuted in January '74, and McClellan was my boss. Got stuck sitting next to me, and Paul was his boss. And Paul left, by August, and Stu left in November. So after 11 months out of grad school, I'm the senior member of the department. And that's why they brought Bob Quinn over from product engineering to basically keep me out of trouble. And I resisted going down to Florida for probably 3 years, and I was sitting and freezing my buns off and playing golf in Teaneck, New Jersey before Thanksgiving. And I said, if he ever offers me the job again, I'm out of here. So I left. Got there. I think I actually started February 4th of '78. And got to see some of the early plants. Stu and me went up, Fort Pierce Electric had put in what was supposed to be a tight membrane softening, or a little tighter than Paul's invention in 5575 for membrane softener. And we got to play with colloidal 189 for the first time. And I remember telling Stu, you're putting too much acid. And I was a glob on the end of the mixer. An amusing place. So it was a great show from '78 to '84 then.
You talk about the plant at Fort Pierce Electric. That had originally been sold to Pheasant Walk, a developer down by Boca Raton. And so as that plant evolved, it got bigger, and that original plant was kind of surplus, but it ended up at Fort Pierce, right?
Yeah.
And using, I guess it was Roga membrane.
Roga membranes, right?
We had a number of...
They were about the only spiral wound membrane around in those days.
Desal.
Well, hydronautics we weren't talking to. So.
Desal Systems, Don Bray,
Was there?
had an element.
Yeah.
Virogenics had them, and Roga had them.
We had a number of systems that were originally installed at one size capacity, and because the particular developer or utility was expanding faster than what was originally anticipated, we actually took some units back. And because we had the fiberglass structural members, which didn't corrode, we could actually rehab these units and make them look almost like new, just replacing the membrane. And so it afforded us to help people who were expanding better or larger than they anticipated, and we could resell the systems and still reuse all the components except for the membrane.
Reminds me why we didn't paint skids, right? It was the whole idea was a maintenance-free structure, so to paint them seems contrary to what they were originally designed to do.
We,
So,
back
Ben, excuse me. Ben, you joined when?
I joined basically about 3 or 4 weeks before Willie arrived. And as Paul said, he was unaware that I was joining his organization. We had met socially repeatedly at church, and he told me about the business that he was in. And when I got out of the Navy, I was working for Pratt & Whitney Aircraft, working on jet engines and that. And, I was not really enthusiastic about some of the work I was doing with the military stuff, and the thought of working on clean water for people, and that sounded like a much better deal. So when the opportunity came, I joined BASIC, and basically I was involved with the technical service and eventually some of the startups and that type of stuff, overseeing some of the construction.
And Bruce, when did you join?
Well, I came in 1980, but and I didn't know these guys at all, any of them, and I didn't know what reverse osmosis was, and I had a rough time probably defining osmosis back then. But I grew up in Michigan, and by the end of the 70s, my wife said, "You move me out of here or you die." So I came down to Florida, and I answered an ad that this guy had put in the paper. And I went into, I had a background in engineering and administration. So I went in to interview for engineering position, and Bill wanted me to take a typing test. So he sat me outside of his office at a desk, and they had an old IBM Selectric, rollerball typewriter. And this young lady gave me a book and said, "Okay, we're going to time you." He was sitting in the other office, and I started typing. And I was just concentrating on trying to get everything right and go through this test, and I could hear him in his office laughing because he thought that all I was doing was slapping my fingers on this typewriter and just, making it look like
110 word a minute type.
So, and then, I think they all had a big laugh over that, and they took the test in, and I guess there was maybe one error or something. So it came out that I could type about 100 words a minute. So he was impressed. And he liked the idea that I could do that, as well as had some background in drafting, and I got hired. And but I remember going to work in the engineering department.
We actually kicked him out of marketing.
Yes.
He originally was interviewing as my secretary because I was notorious for chewing him up. I think he would have been my 39th.
But that's when we had no computers and everything was hand drawn, and we had a room set up inside of Basic Technologies that had
A wang.
10.
He had a dictaphone and a wang, or a wang.
Right,
and a
but the
dictaphone.
drafting tables is what I'm
Oh, yeah,
talking
SCAD
about.
and
And
the
we had
drafting.
big, huge tables with the tilt-up boards, and 10 or 15 tables in that room.
Yeah.
And so that's what I remember doing in the first year of Basic Technologies, is drawing parts that I had no idea what they were all about or what they were for, and got a complete education from these gentlemen right here.
Good, good.
Got to know Stu's numbering system rather well.
Oh yeah, I wound up doing a few other things in the company over the years, and went from engineering to finance to administration to marketing, and did quite a bit of the literature as years went by.
Bruce?
When you first started, let's see, I moved to Florida in 1977, so you guys had been in business about 3 years at that time. What was this has always fascinated me when people decide to start a company that's focused on a particular technology. How did you keep going in the early days?
barely.
Barely. Because, you know, there wasn't a lot of work in Florida. in
Well, we
those
had a
days.
board of directors that were very supportive. And they grilled me one night a month. And I always, you know, wanted to put on the best that we could do. But I didn't want to let lack of ethics and integrity get involved. So they were rather harsh. But that was good because that forced us to do things.
Right.
And I think this thing with membrane softening that we originated, this started after that group of people had been bought out by a member of one of the Saudi families, the Jamjums, and I guess it started when we had the original board, because I remember the first telephone call I made, and it was to Ted Larson at Roga, and the logic of that was that I knew that through the water desaling report that he had a contract with OSW to produce a low-pressure membrane. And I put two and two together, and I talked with him, and I said, we want to take out about half of the monovalent ions and maybe 75 or 80% of the divalent ions. And the logic was, at that time, Florida was under a mandate for dual barrier because all of South Florida was involved in the superficial aquifer, and which was high in organics, which brought on high trihalomethanes. That was plus the ability to soften the water. So we could reduce the organic content, we could produce a softened water without using a regenerative salt system. So it just made common sense. And Ted says, I'll make you that membrane. It was called the 4160 LP 4160.
I think an S on it, yeah.
Pardon?
4160S.
Anyhow, it was, and then we named it the 5575 membrane, and that was the precursor to nanofiltration.
Yeah.
And nanofiltration came along after Roga dropped out because it was all cellulose acetate, and we were able to Larson and Erickson from Film Tech came to visit us one day, and they had spun off from North Star and had started Film Tech. I remember Larson said that was Larson too. He said to me, he says, where is this industry going? And I said, membrane softening, that would be the biggest user of the number of square feet of membrane. And so he took off on that with the North Star research that had been done, and of course the rest is history.
Yeah.
But that was the beginning of really doing it. I guess we had installed a couple million gallons of cellulose acetate membrane, but the North Star membrane was so superior in so many ways that it just.
I remember the first 2.5 incher I worked on was a Film Tech in Saudi in '79. We had these little 007 units. They were big on 007, 008s, James Bond days. So that was the baby product line that made 70 or 140 gallons a day. And Paul would sell them to Saudi by the container load.
Well, we had the other divisions, the back. You hadn't talked about that.
Yeah, how did you come up with the idea of having these little self-contained units of, fairly low daily
The
production?
biggest mistakes BTI ever made was not really chasing that into the home market, because we were taking an industrial look at it. And if you look at a picture of a 007, you can see the thread of an industrial appearing rather than nice rounded corners and the under the sink units you see. But that was really all these homes in Jeddah and Dhahran over that, more than in Riyadh, the water was just terrible, and they were building these mansions, and so they had the 007s and the 008s, and we were able to kind of, quotation marks, mass produce those, really for the Middle Eastern market. But they didn't take care of them.
So how did you originally get involved in the Middle East?
I guess the first job was the plants we built for
Medina and
Riyadh.
Actually, we had somebody we met at one of the trade shows with regard to the orchids.
Yeah, is that where it's
At
at?
Marie Selby Gardens.
Mm-hmm.
And we were selling small reverse osmosis units to the orchid growers.
Yeah, Everglades Orchid. The guy was head of the Orchid Association.
And so that's how we got, one of the Saudis got wind of us a little bit and just progressed from there. But
And then we sold the 2 units through an engineering company or a contractor here in, what's the name of that?
U.S. Engineers.
U.S.
in
Engineers.
Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And Paul says these American construction companies got a lead on a couple of RO plants. Why don't you go over there and see what you can do? So I went over in the summer of '76, put together a couple of proposals for the airport at Riyadh and the airport in Medina. And we got, those were the first 2 Saudi jobs. And that also got us some exposure to the Saudi people that eventually formed Sabat in partnership with Basic Technologies. I went over in '78 in another aspect. We were running a pilot study at the sewer plant using CA spiral elements to rehab the effluent from the sewer plant so it could be used for industrial purposes.
Jeddah.
In Jeddah.
Reuse.
Well, they eventually built a big plant, didn't they?
Yeah, we lost it.
Ames
It was-
Cross to Babcock built a big
Right,
plant.
we
there.
had, there were 13 contractors bid the job, and 12 of them used us, and actually Babcock has to do it, and they owned Ajax at the time, which had the rights to fluid systems membranes outside of the States. We were gonna make a killing with Film Tech, because we were gonna use ultrafiltration up front, give Film Tech an order for about $3 million when they were doing $2 million worth of business. And here we lose the job.
Now, Ben, you had to, these guys did their magic tricks, you had to go and actually service these things.
Yes, I did a couple of trips over, and it was very interesting, as they were alluding, as Paul was alluding, that, you know, if they didn't take care of the units, you'd go out on a service visit, you know, a unit had been in place for 2 months or 3 months or that kind of stuff, and they'd be complaining it wasn't working, and you'd find that they had closed the concentrate valve completely because they discovered it would make a little bit more water, but it was only a very short period of time that it made that, and then it died, you know. And then you'd explain to them what they'd done wrong, and then they would go, well, no, I didn't do that. Well, how did that valve get closed? You know, you were too dumb to even open it back up.
We should have had an orifice in there. rather
Yes,
than
that
a
would
valve.
have, actually, I think we eventually
We
did
did do
resolve by putting orifices in to take that temptation away.
Where was it, in Daharan, they put you out, and you woke up and the goat was eating your blanket?
Yes, I was, yeah, the accommodations were Spartan, to say the least. And there was no door on the building that I was staying on, and woke up and there was a goat in the room with me, and he felt that the blanket looked like lunch. But yeah, we survived.
I never heard that story.
Oh, yeah. The next time I went back, they treated me a little better, though. They put me up at the Red Sea Palace.
Well, this was back in the 70s.
Yes, yeah, it was.
When they were open in Jeddah, the sewage ran right down along, you know, flume alongside the sidewalk, you know, raw sewage.
Yeah. And one of the things that when you started Basic Technologies, companies like Roga and Hydronautics and Virogenics were also in the same business and making their own membranes. Was it hard for Basic to compete in that market when you had companies that were actually making their own membranes competing against you?
And building their own system.
And building their own systems, yeah.
In a vertical manner. Yeah, and we always, Dow, Film Tech, in the later years, didn't believe in vertical integration and building their own systems, and they, treated membrane as a commodity. So that's one thing that led us to Film Tech, because Roga, they would build the big systems themselves. They were trying to wear both hats,
Right.
as there was Envirogenics.
DuPont really was another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, they built.
They didn't want to be, they wanted somebody between them and the end user.
Right.
To take the liability risk. It was, I have always been a firm supporter, as these guys know, of Film Tech, because if there was a problem, they stood behind it.
Right. Right.
And others, we heard horror stories about the membrane manufacturers kind of wanting to run, like DuPont, it was very specific. They wanted you to take the liability that they should have because it was their product that you were applying.
In the early days, you used a lot of Dow hollow fiber membranes.
That came later. DuPont was, for Dow, the first job I lost in my career was for El Paso Gas and Electric, and Dow popped up as a 4-incher in early '74 with Garchem. And amusingly enough, it's like having a history of losing trouble jobs. It's where they discovered barium sulfate fouling.
Yeah.
Plus, they did allow us to add welding slag in the permeator. So we've always had a history of losing trouble jobs.
Dow was also a
When
good.
we needed them bad.
It was
At
also,
one time, yeah, we had more Dow.
But later, as you
That's
said, always the
basic
best
technology.
job
We
I
were the
ever worked,
largest
so.
installer of Dow membranes in the world,
Yeah,
with
we
the
did.
Dow cellulose triacetate hollow fibers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we did a lot.
Dow
The old
also
20Ks.
stood behind the product because there are quite a few jobs that we had where we got into trouble, and it was not through the membrane or our problem, but just we didn't know certain things and we found out about it. So Autech was a place where they replaced the membranes after about a year, free of charge, and there was another facility, Venice Gardens, because I did a cleaning out there, and with the procedure that Sharon Whipple had given me to clean the CA membranes, there was a thermal reaction, chemical reaction, and the side of the steel, epoxy-coated steel pressure vessels were hot to the touch. So what we did was we
Kinda melted
cleaned, we cleaned the elements. We got the pressure dropped down, but we lost flow and the rejection was great. So we actually annealed the membrane in situ.
In place.
Anyway. And I
Yeah,
went back
seawater
to
barrier.
Dow and I said, look, we were following your cleaning instructions, and we're a small company. We can't afford to, cough up the money for these
That's
replacements.
about 12 permeator.
Yeah. So Janet Hickman agreed that we could get free membranes in both of those situations. So we did get good support from Dow, and we actually were the first ones to introduce their low pressure, quote, hollow fiber Dowex membranes. And that was really a product that sort of put membrane softening on the back burner for a while, because we were talking about membrane softening plants with CA membrane operating at about 250 psi, and then Dow comes out with this brackish water membrane that's practically operating in the same pressure range. So all of a sudden, it became a situation which sort of stalled or delayed the progress of membrane softening until we worked with Film Tech and they came out with the NF70.
Well, about that time, Film Tech had come out with their product. I remember Ben, we put it over at the Charlotte Harbor,
Yeah.
and it was a 400-pound membrane. So we were running an average of 28 GFD in the plant. The plant ran great.
I ran great.
Within a couple of weeks of Dow coming out with the 250, Film Tech re-rated the membrane to 225, and it went from a 12,000-gallon day element to 7,500. But they were finding most of their stuff was on river water. They couldn't sustain the flux anyway.
Right.
But on Florida, that water whizzed along because we had a 1 SDI, and it was
Yeah.
fabulous, like working on permeate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hey, we talking about some of our Mideast projects and that were a little interesting. Remember the Bahrain race course?
Yeah.
And that was a plant that was built, and I don't remember.
English company,
An
like
English
an
company.
Aquapure.
Yeah, they built them, but they had put the degasifier in the front.
In front.
And
I remember hearing
That was a
about that.
loaded
Yes.
H2S plant, too.
yeah, and Bill went over, you know, and he says, "Whoops, that's not so good." So then I went back over and we replaced all the bundles, you know, because the casing was still good, but they had fouled them just incredibly.
No, it was hot water. It was like
Yeah, it was
95
very warm
degrees.
water.
The
And-
CTA didn't last long.
No.
And also,
18,000.
yeah, and in their infinite wisdom, you know, all the storage tanks were painted black, you know, in the Saudi sun, so they were doing everything they possibly could to help themselves. But, yeah, that was quite an interesting project. I can remember going over there, and they gave me a group of people that were from Sri Lanka, and they were relatively small people, and I was concerned, you know, about hurting them because these were fairly heavy to handle, and said, "Don't worry about it, if you break one, we'll get you another."
They dumped 800,000 gallons a day on a grass track that only ran 1 month a year in November. And you'd come around these sandstone dunes and, you know, small hills, and all of a sudden, here's Calder Racetrack with this magnificent grandstand and clubhouse of all glass sitting out in the middle of nowhere. And they had an 18-hole golf course with grass greens. So they dumped a lot of water on it. And you took your little 1-foot piece of AstroTurf out as your fairway, and, you know, away you went.
Did you find in those days in the Middle East, did you find it difficult to do business?
Yes and no. The story goes like this. We had, we went from the United Engineers,
Yes.
from that job from Medina.
No, U.S. engineers.
We met Awad El Shamrani, and he was a local Jeddah-based businessman. And Awad took very good interest in, or very high interest in this thing called desalination, because you could just see, and this was in the period of time when Roga built that, or at
Jeddah 1.
at Jeddah 1, 3 million gallon a day?
Yep.
Seawater plant, and they had their pressure vessel problems too. But
Few piping problems.
as it went on, then Awad introduced us to the Jamjoon family, and this was a cousin. The father was Minister of Agriculture for the Western region, and he had sons Ziad and Hassan, who were cousins of the old Ida. I can't remember
Issam.
what his first name was.
Issam. Issam.
Issam Jamjoon. They were first cousins. So that gave us a lot of entrees in the job. But what caused us to falter in Saudi Arabia was when Smith, what was his first name that had water desalination report?
Richard
Dick Smith.
Dick Smith. Well, Dick Smith wrote an article about that we were interrelated with the Minister of Agriculture and Water for the Western region.
That was it, huh?
That was it. And he did come to me years later and apologize. But we weren't connected, but we were, you know,
Yeah.
through Hassan and Ziad. And Hassan and Ziad were real nice young Saudi that were, Hassan was, they were both engineers.
Hassan was a pilot.
No, the
No,
older
that was
brother.
another
Older
brother.
brothers.
Yeah, Hassan was,
But they treated us, we just got along real well. And so then Hassan bought out this first board of directors that we had and brought some fresh capital into BTI. And, but they, because of that situation, we were blocked.
Yeah.
I forget, there were 3 or 4 jobs that were sizable jobs that we just totally lost out on, even though we were low bidder.
Well, we were the first victim of that Saudi law, and it must have been in just about 80, Al Burke. And
Yes.
we were pushing the Tioba hollow fiber, and we were low by 9.6%. And they had just enacted a Saudi law that said if a Saudi manufacturer was within 10% of the low bidder, they get the job.
Yeah.
And that was Al Kafji, was it?
Yeah.
So they wound up getting that job, and because of that, we went probably 0 for 5 in these $70 million type projects that just chew up $100,000 of time and people to even bid them.
Yeah.
And we distinctly went 0 for 5 in them, and then we said, that's enough. We're not gonna bid them anymore.
And like Bruce mentioned a little bit ago to me, that Sabat actually stood for Saudi Basic Technologies, SABAT. And it was a Saudi company, and which was very important then. So we were in the launch position, and there was where we ran this pilot plant on the wastewater for water reuse. Yahya Koshak was the engineer for Jeddah that handled all this type of thing. And we were spec'd in on that. It was basic technologies, no equal, right? And we had our model numbers in that bid. And so we bid, there were 6 contractors, and Ames Costa Babcock out of England were one of the 6. Well, we bid to all these contractors as a sole source. Well, and I can't remember the guy's name that was running that company at the time, but MacArthur, was it? Yeah. And Rascal, he bid it direct with everything, not using, and he took a job away from us. Again, he was low bidder, but that was a heartbreaker, because we were in a position to be one of the first applications of reusing wastewater. And Yahya had even gone to, there was a professor at Iowa State that said it was okay to reuse the water, and this is against the Quran. But then whoever he was in Saudi that was responsible for this, Yahya got him to approve the idea of reusing water. That was the first time.
Right.
And it was through a study that was done by a Saudi professor at Iowa State.
You were growing tomatoes at the plant.
Yeah, we had a little garden.
Yeah.
They were gonna use it for industrial purposes only, not for potable.
Yeah,
purposes.
Now, at the peak of the company's activities, how many employees did you have?
25?
Yeah, it wasn't huge, right?
Yeah, it was never really, really big, but that sounds about right.
Probably should have had 15.
And some of those people are still in the business today?
Yeah.
Yes, Bill Snow.
Yeah, Bill Snow.
Yeah.
Bill Snow worked for you guys?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes, yes.
Uh-huh.
We sent Bill Snow, we had one of the first UF seawater RO combination plants. We built these 10,000 gallon a dayers for the Pakistani Navy, and Bill Snow had the pleasure of going to start them up because they were tucked right on the Iranian border, so you had to fly them by helicopter.
I went,
You went there too?
yeah. I went there before they had
That would have been
installed.
84. Ultraviolet, it was a nice little UF ultraviolet RO as a package plant.
Skid mounted,
Mhm.
all skid.
FRP, no
Another-
corrosion.
You want to hear a funny story? We talked about fiberglass, and we always thought of fiberglass skids and structural members as being very fragile, because they go like this real easy. They never break. However, I forget where this plant originally came from. Remember, we sold it to the
It was the
Mexicans?
original
That came from
Broadstone.
Broadview. and
Broadview
it
condominium.
Came from Broadview.
It was the original Broadview.
To Cuesta.
And it was,
Went to
that was the
Mexico.
first plant we built. Well, this goes to Yetla too, which is down in the mountains on the way to Acapulco from Mexico City. And a big dam project, and they were using this for drinking water for the construction workers. And it's the only time they dropped that bloody unit when they took it off the truck.
I thought they rolled the container down the hill.
Well,
No,
That was a different one?
No.
it dropped
They
it.
rolled the degasifier down the hill, but the unit they dropped.
Because I went down there they said, oh, you have to come now. So we went down, and man, that baby was busted up. And you went down
Okay, with
and
Frank Shoemaker.
put it back together.
Yes, yeah.
Frank went with you?
Frank went with me, yeah. And there was 2 damaged pressure vessels, and the only way in and out of this place was a helicopter. And so they strapped them to the skids, the landing skids and that stuff. And it looked like we were you know, about to
Hey,
rake the valley with pressure vessels and, you know, rocket launchers.
We had one that we sold out to Bakersfield, and Paul was a big believer in what we called pillow blocks, and he painted them green fiberglass foam-filled pillow blocks so that the structure looked like, instead of an empty egg crate, solid. And that was his marketing. So this thing goes across 3,300 miles, and the truck must have had a flat spot on a tire because it literally beat the heck out of it. That by the time the pillow blocks themselves had disintegrated and started to crumble.
While it was going cross country?
So we wound up having to go and rebuild that thing over there. Then the worst, we were doing Acme in Wellington, Florida, or just outside of West Palm Beach, and they got the mix wrong in the pillow block, and in the dead of summer, the bottom one started creeping.
Oh, I remember
So
that.
Ben got
I remember that.
to go out there with 4x4 wood and hold the thing up, and that was the demise of the pillow blocks. We still have some of them hanging around, but we changed that skid one by one into structural fiberglass shapes, and that was the last pillow block plant ever built, a big
Yeah,
one.
but that was, the pillar block was kind of a calling card for basic technologies,
Well,
because
the
you were the only
concept-
guys that used them.
Was the concept was the thinking fiberglass structural members were fragile. This way you could build it in the field, and it went together just like a Lego.
Right.
And I think, to this day, I still like it.
Well, the very original pillow blocks were actually concrete filled.
Yeah.
Original ones.
Yes.
Ocean Trail
Yeah.
was
Yeah, those were concrete filled and then
pillow blocks
filled.
filled with
Didn't
concrete.
somebody later on make an attempt to
Yes.
use the
Built it.
same kind of?
Rogo, wasn't it?
Wasn't it?
Ionics used them.
No, no, no.
No,
It was
no,
some, it was some outfit up in the Washington
it was
D.C.
Fluid
area that was
Systems,
building
didn't
them for the military.
Yeah, somebody did eventually
Yeah,
manufacture.
you remember Walt Barnes?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a company that Walt Barnes went to work for when he
Right.
retired.
when he left the government.
Yeah,
when he left the government.
Dave Furakawa was involved, and they
Yeah.
put it together with a bunch of screws. Instead of having just two halves, they had 4 quarters.
That's right.
That's
And they bolted
right,
them
yes.
together.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that one of the concepts was that they could actually, by bolting enough pieces together, you could make, like a 30 vessel
Whatever you wanted. yeah.
support,
I
yeah.
think that was Rogo.
No, this was way after Rogo was out of the systems business.
Okay.
Somebody did have an open mesh one in
I can't remember the
California.
name
One
of
of
it.
the four
See
pieces
through.
that they bolted together.
Yeah. And you pioneered the fiberglass frames.
First one.
You were the first ones. Jimmy copied everything you did.
Well, Jimmy used to install for us at Bermuda.
Yeah.
That was his introduction in the RO.
He installed Punta
Sorrento,
Gorda.
on the Gorda.
He
Punta
did, yeah,
Gorda
he
was
did
the
Burnt
first
Store.
one. Yeah, Burnt Store.
First one.
Yeah,
Of Jimmy's,
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I went to the people who manufactured the structural members to figure out or find out how to build skids. They looked at me with a blank face. We don't know how to build skids. Everybody just buys the product and they figure out their own way how to use it, and that was it. So I came back home and Paul says, "What'd you learn?" When I told him nothing, he was a little bit upset. But
But we never painted them either. I
No.
mean, that was one of the things, and it also proved that we were using first cuts. It was good product. There was never any.
Yeah,
hiding.
we always object to somebody's painting because you can not only mix and match colors and manufacturers, but nobody would know if you put in a used product.
Right.
Who knows what's under the paint? Where you had to be much more of a craftsman putting this stuff together. People would say, "What's my deduct for not painting?" Well, it actually probably took more time and more meticulous handling to do the skid without painting, because you could nicks
Yeah, you
and
can cover
scratches,
a lot.
yeah.
Yeah, you can cover
Well,
a
here you
lot
gotta
with
buff
paint.
it and polish it, and the fiberglass comes with its own coating on it that's, basically weatherproof.
Right.
2 years ago in my semi-retired state, I was asked to tear apart a plant on Hutchison Island,
Joe's point.
Joe's Point. And this it had 2 skids on it, 2 fiberglass skids. And so we disassembled it and tore it out. Bill sent a truck up and took the 2 skids back to his shop. He still has one, but he sold one, and with I would assume a can of Comet and a brush, he could make that fiberglass skid look just like brand
Well,
new.
we did that when we were moving some Venice ones that came in from 1980. And yeah, you just clean the dirt and the oil or whatever had accumulated on them, and they look virtually brand new. And everybody always thought they were put together with stainless pop rivets, but they're really aluminum for the vast majority, until the
no.
bigger sizes.
That's not true, they were stainless.
The early ones were definitely stainless.
what we
Because I
had
can remember
done-
seeing them get annealed.
We
Yeah.
pulled out the pins,
The mandrels.
the mandrels, the pop rivet, and annealed them so they were softer like the aluminum, because with the stainless steel pop rivets, the way they came from the manufacturer, when you tried to apply them, they just pull right through the fiberglass. It couldn't resist the... And so by annealing the mandrels, we could get the right type of break, similar to an aluminum rivet, but we built them with stainless steel.
I'm going to ask each of you in turn, Bill, if there was one project that you did while at Basic Technologies that was either the most interesting or the most challenging or the most fun, which one would you pick?
Well, Venice, the expansion of Venice from, we put in two Dow hollow fiber skids expanding the DuPont was interesting because we got to have to use a common cleaning system. And here is a plant that had been in existence for 6 years, and I have to discover that the cleaning pump has been running backwards all that time, and they were wondering why they weren't getting effective cleaning. Well, that when you pull the level switch out of the gasifier and the fire department comes running over because
Yeah.
it sends a silent alarm.
Yeah, they had a few wiring glitches at that place.
Was that original plant at Venice was polymetric?
Right.
Yes.
Put it in '74.
DuPont
Right.
membrane.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right, that's right.
And
Yeah,
that
big old-
what preceded that was ED.
Yeah.
And so they really have an experience in desalting history right at that plant themselves.
That's right, that's right. Stuart, what about you? What was your
Probably
most
working
memorable project?
Sanibel, because we originally remembraned the 3 original trains with Film Tech membrane, and there's an interesting story about how Film Tech got in there. I don't know if you remember this, but Bill here convinced the user to install Brand X, and they installed Brand X membrane to run alongside the original hydronautic CA membrane, and when it came to replacing the hydronautics membrane, they were up to around 550 psi for the feed pressure required to maintain flow. And Brand X was basically where it started from day one. So they had a first-hand experience on using thin film composites, and so that was really the first large thin film composite.
Before I left Sanibel, we'd put up a single element Film Tech running parallel to Train A
Yeah.
at the plant, and that ran for a long time, even after I left. Yeah, yeah.
And then we built on that at Film Tech when I went to work for Film Tech by being able to test prototype brackish water elements there and determine whether or not they were good. And believe it or not, we ran into certain circumstances where we were trying a different brine spacer, and it took about a year, but the brine spacer that they had put in extruded, and all of a sudden I get a call from the plant and the delta P has gone up. Now, they never had any problems with differential pressure because of the water, how clean it was. So it was very surprising until we took the elements out of the pressure vessels and we could see this problem with the brine spacer. So we went in and replaced all of the elements in Train D, or which whenever was set up. Train E maybe it was. So we learned a lot working with that client and being able to truly field test prototype elements.
Paul, how about you?
Yeah, when you ask the question, you know, I can't think of any that are greater than the other. They was all fun.
Yeah.
Maybe financially not successful, but it was fun.
What about the most challenging?
I know the one.
Which one? Which one do you think is the most challenging?
Well, it's the one that came to my mind is the Pakistan Navy job when we had that letter of credit that we had a timing situation.
Oh, yeah. See, that's where I got more involved, in chasing those bloody letters of credit. And everybody was doing all they could, and I think I came apart at time few times, that, we've got to ship the bloody thing. The letter of credit's going to go stale, and when it goes stale,
Well, it got kind of crazy. I just remember the entire company, and we didn't have everything. And I don't want to get us in trouble here, but I can remember wrapping up a few things like a pair of shoes or, a wrench and calling it part number X, and we were going to deal with it later when we got over there to erect it on site. But we got that out. That was a challenging project.
yeah, I think chasing LCs internationally was a challenge of my life.
Yeah.
Because we weren't exactly flush with cash, and we needed to turn our money pretty quick. And if by the time you redo an LC and get an extension on it, another 60 days goes by. So those were the challenges.
Yeah. Bruce?
Well, that was the one. I was
That was the
when
one?
you hit me with that as a Pakistani.
Ben, I'm sure, running around fixing all this stuff was,
Well, like Paul said, so many of them were memorable and some of them were really quite enjoyable. I guess if I had to pick one that I found kind of interesting was Bernac Produce, where we had to treat, they basically had a reservoir that they caught rainwater in and that stuff that had everything, including alligators living in it. And we put in a UF unit and then, an RO unit and that kind of stuff. And this was a large hydroponic cucumber farm, basically, is what they were.
Herbless cucumber.
Yeah, the
But, yeah,
long European.
Yeah, the European
Seedless.
cucumbers and that. But at any rate, they desperately had to have their water, and they were running out of water. And I can remember I would get up in the middle of the night because the UF unit kept wanting to clog and that stuff. So I'd be doing back flushes at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the dogs chasing me through the fields and that stuff. It was quite memorable, but eventually we got it straightened out and it ran pretty well.
Sure, we used the screens up front, and they had socks over them. And Ben went backwashed them, and gee, everything's nice. And somebody walks out and looks at the canal, and there's the socks floating down the canal. They had little ties instead
Yes.
of stainless bands. They had little knots.
Yeah, going, the SDI seems a little high today.
But the reason that was so that was a fascinating installation. The production that they grew these burpless cucumbers, on stakes, or maybe there were wires or cables going, whatever. They went up in the air, and then the cucumber, they wanted a 12-inch cucumber that was straight, and those cucumbers looked like this. And after we put in the RO, they
needed
went
less
straight,
than 25 sodium.
Yeah, that was the whole issue. If
There was sodium?
If you had sodium in the water, then the cucumber would curl, and then it wouldn't go through the packing machines. So they were just tossed away and fed to the pig farmer. Pig farmers used it.
Yeah.
But when you dropped the sodium, it simulated rainwater, then the cucumber would grow absolutely straight, and it would go through the wrapping machines. And that was the whole issue. Wet water was good to grow cucumbers, but they wouldn't grow straight. You had to have.
who found that out?
They did.
They did, yeah.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, it was Bernac Produce. They were out of, the company was owned out of Canada, but
It was actually a subsidiary of
Denmark.
Vlasic Pickles.
yeah, and
Denmark.
the parent company and that stuff, and then they were located up in Fort Pierce.
They had one other additional benefit. Typically, the cucumbers only came out on the new growth out of the plant. And when they used the water from the RO, they actually were able to get cucumbers out of the old growth of the plant. So the cucumbers were coming out, which allowed them to use the plant a longer period of
Longer
time.
period of time.
Well, I think the yield went up something like
Yeah.
70%.
Oh, it was amazing.
They loved their
That's
RO.
pretty significant.
Well, it was also just amazing to see how fast these plants would grow. They told me, and I didn't believe them, so they said, okay, here's your seed. You go plant that, in there, and then every day, because I was going up there almost every day, you look at your plant. And from the time I put that thing in the ground, they were able to pick a cucumber off of it in about 45 days.
I just happened to think of something. I'm sorry, Ben, but I think we were involved in maybe it's very popular now, and everybody does it, and that's bottled water. But weren't we one of the first companies to provide reverse osmosis to the Bahamas with Aquapure?
Yeah.
And Jerry McSweeney was bottling water back then when nobody else was doing it, but he was also using the water for his mixes, for his soft drinks, and
Initially, he was just water.
Just water.
Yeah, the
right.
later, that was a Shasta plant Ben took apart with Chip
Yeah,
Harris in Birmingham,
From
Alabama.
Birmingham,
It's like,
Alabama,
what,
he shipped to the
53
Bahamas.
containers and a 250-ton carbo cooler? And half the equipment went to Taiwan and half the equipment went to the Bahamas. The other one, we didn't really go many times in person, but we were using Dow hollow fibers in nuclear power plants to separate the boron from the silica. And that was Jessup and that
Yeah.
group up there next to Duke Energy in North Carolina, Dale
Was that a
Jessup.
Sergeant Lundy job?
No, those were the ones they were doing themselves, not the laundry radways. This was physically working on the pressurized water too in those reactors.
And when it went bad, it just got buried. There was no working on that very much.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, you're talking about bottled water. Back when we were in Bermuda, they had Sterling was into putting vending machines, I guess, primarily in California. And DuPont had a deal with them, but they had to buy the membrane through one of the 7 licensees. But it'd be like $1 million order.
yeah.
And you want to see, people putting $1,000 because all you're really doing is writing a purchase order. And it got to be a bloodbath, you know what I'm saying?
The people have always told me that the municipal market in Florida was a bloodthirsty business, and you guys were in it for quite a while.
You've been very kind in your choice of words.
But you get. I used to get telephone calls, and wait, how could they bid this low? That's my cost. And I said, if you're all bidding the same stuff, you should all have the same cost, pretty much. And
Well, it turned out
and
it
I've
wasn't
always-
true, because that happened to us in a couple of jobs in Saudi, that they were bidding, 10% below our cost. And then I can remember my classic opening my mouth for, was it Vero? Oslo Road, lost the job like 4 different times. And I'm sitting with Paul and a bunch of contractors, and I open my mouth and say, I'm 99% sure we're going to be low at this price. And we were 4th. And Water Services America bid like $100,000 below our cost on about a $1.2 million job, a $900,000 job.
What I'm the happiest with is that we have, Basic Technologies was always customer, people oriented. We came close to getting sued once that I can think of. This was by St. Mary's Hospital in, wasn't there, Mangonia Park or wherever. And it was a 1,000-gallon-a-day plant. Sold it for $4,000 to the plumbing contractor. And so we put the unit in, it ran fine, and West Palm Beach changed their treatment to alum. Well, we said right on our literature that we weren't responsible if the feed water source changed it drastically. I'll never forget that woman at that dialysis center. She was just livid that we were going to kill somebody. Well, the thing is, the unit plugged, the membrane plugged up, right? Because of shifting at the saturation of the alum. And so we had a meeting. It was the mechanical engineer, it was the architect, and myself, along with probably a half a dozen lawyers. They're along Flagler in West Palm. And they said, here's what we're going to do, Paul. You're going to take that back. And we'll split the cost 3 ways. And I fought him. And my attorney, Dave Gorman, says, take it, it's a deal. But it made me very angry in that they were putting the monkey on our back and we didn't deserve it.
Talking about Dave Gorman, there was another project where we wound up going before a judge, and what we were...
On the other side.
On the other side. And what the client was claiming is that we were selling used equipment that, and he was not aware of it, supposedly not aware of it. And we took out the drawings. I had gone up there with Paul, and on the drawings for the particular pieces of hardware, they were hydropneumatic tanks, storage tanks. We didn't erase the name of the original project. We just put a line through it and put the new project on the top of it. The judge saw that, and all of a sudden the lawyers called a meeting, and that was the end of it. The fact that we had shown the the change or the relationship
Yeah.
from job to job really ended this lawsuit real quick. So we weren't we couldn't be accused of selling somebody something that he shouldn't be aware of that was used.
Yeah. So how many years was Basic Technologies in business total?
September 23rd, 1974 to October 3rd, 1986.
Six.
1986. And what motivated you to close the doors?
The bankruptcy, of course.
I'll answer that.
Okay.
Originally, before we went bankrupt, we were in bankruptcy. Dow, FilmTech was going to buy Basic Technologies because they wanted to be able to compete with hydronautics and build systems. And at the time, we were ready to sign all the deals. The president, the CEO, and the controller come down to Basic Technologies, and before we get started, they say, well, we're not going to do what we planned to do or what we told you we were coming down to do. And they said, we're not going to sign. So this took Paul and I and a few other people in the office back. And then the next thing that bothered us, but we can't tell you why. And this was the time when Dow started negotiations to purchase FilmTech, so they wanted everything to lay low. After the deal was consummated, Dow came down to FilmTech, to BTI, and said, okay, we're going to buy you, like FilmTech had planned. And then there was a shakeup at Dow, and the heads that were interested in buying BTI changed, and the new guys came in and said, we're not going to buy you, and we wouldn't have bought FilmTech. And after that, Paul and I looked at each other. There was no hope. We just closed the doors. We were so deep in the hole at that point.
Yeah. Well, there
And Ben and I we left in '84, like
Right.
April and May of '84, so we were gone 2 years before that. And we wound up buying probably 1/3 of the assets at the auction and picked up Ted Pun, who's still working for us, who works in Basic since '30 as the production shop manager.
No, Water Service America went out of business.
Yes.
And a couple others also went out of business. And Roger and Hydronautics pulled out Envirogenics went down the drain.
You know, from a applier of membrane, it's so easy to go into the business. And it's easier to get out. It's harder to get out when you want to get out.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you guys certainly, you're a Florida firm, and this was the market for membrane technology for a long time. And so you're...
I have a picture of Rotunda West from the Permuted days, and the caption on the outside of the building on the placard said, the largest reverse osmosis system in the world.
That's right.
500,000 gallons a day.
500,000 gallons a
half a
day, yeah. Yeah, that was what, 1972? Yeah, that wasn't a long time before you started Basic Technologies.
Well, and later, one of the jobs we did at Permuted was Cape Carl's first 3 million gallons a day.
Right, that's right.
And it was 500,000 gallon a day skids.
That was the biggest brackish water RO plant in the world.
Yeah.
For a long time.
At that time, for a long
Yeah,
time.
for a long time, yeah. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. We could probably continue this for a long time, but we've got lunch to go to and a few other things to do, so thank you for coming. And you will, when we get the results of this, you will each receive a copy with the compliments of AMTA. And I hope you'll look at it and have a good chuckle at yourself.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.